This is Lecture 12, Emotional and Motivated Behavior, and it corresponds to Chapter 12 of your textbook.
Okay, so moving on to Chapter 12, this is Section 1, Identifying the Causes of Behavior. This section is about emotion and motivation, and emotion and motivation have a lot in common, and therefore we're kind of covering both of these in the same chapter. Emotion is a complex pattern of changes, including physiological arousal, feelings, cognitive processes, as well as behavioral reactions that are made in response to a situation perceived to be personally significant. This is the APA definition of emotion. And then motivation is the process of starting, directing, and maintaining physical and psychological activities, including mechanisms involved in preferences for one activity or another, as well as the vigor and persistence of responses. So you can see with these definitions that both of these are kind of broad constructs, broad topics that cover a lot of different processes. There are many different causes of behavior, of course. Our brain is specifically designed for certain behaviors to be naturally rewarding, and these are typically things that help us to survive. So food, sex helps us procreate, exercise keeps us healthy and strong, and our brain is naturally designed for that to be rewarding. The brain as well craves stimulation, so we are naturally curious, especially in our younger stages, like kids, babies are naturally curious. Sensory deprivation, having no stimulation, is very aversive to us. One of the worst punishments you can give an individual is long-term solitary confinement. The absence of stimuli actually often makes our brain create its own stimulation. So people in solitary confinement, especially if it's dark in there, in the least humane contexts of solitary confinement, people have hallucinations. Their brain starts making up stimuli, as well as having heightened senses, so maybe having a really strong sense of smell in the absence of visual stimulation. Reward circuits in the brain are activated by both endogenous or inside stimuli that comes from inside your own brain, such as hormones and neurotransmitters, as well as thoughts and feelings. So thinking about something can be rewarding. Thinking about someone that you're in love with can be a rewarding activity in itself. Reward circuits can also be activated by exogenous or outside stimuli, such as sights and sounds and smells from the environment. Moving on to Section 2, the chemical senses. The chemical senses include olfaction, which is the sense of smell, and gustation, the sense of taste. They are called chemical senses because the environmental stimuli interact directly with the receptors in these two senses. They appear to be less complex in general than other sensory systems, so we are going to cover it in a little less detail. But there's also a lot we don't know, especially about olfaction. And so there's certainly the paucity of information that we have may not actually represent the full complexity of the system. Olfaction in general is more primitive, and it's highly connected with emotion and memory and motivation as well. So that's why we're covering the chemical senses in the motivation and emotion chapter, is because these senses are intimately involved with emotion and motivation. So olfactory receptor neurons interact directly with substances from the environment, with the chemicals that come in through the air. Olfactory epithelium, which is this layer of tissue, has receptors and support cells embedded within it. The receptor cells have 10 to 20 cilia, which protrude from the olfactory mucosa. This is kind of like mucus in the olfactory system. Scent chemicals dissolve in this olfactory mucosa, which then connect with the olfactory receptors that are specialized to respond to a different range of scents. So just like how different rods and cones in the retina respond to different light stimuli or different aspects of light stimuli, olfactory receptors specialize in different scents, different types of chemicals. Odors activate a pattern of specialized receptors, and then the summed activation of these codes for a given scent in the brain. Olfactory pathways in the brain. So this goes from olfactory receptor cells to the olfactory bulb, which is the main olfactory area in the brain. Olfactory receptor cells create balls of dendrites, and these synapse with something called mitral cells. Mitral cells send their axons to forebrain areas, in particular the amygdala. So the olfactory system is very highly connected with the amygdala. Amygdala we'll talk about a bit more later, and we've talked about in the past, but amygdala is responsible for a number of things, including emotional memory and the valence of emotional response, fear response, etc. The piriform cortex, which is also called the primary olfactory cortex, also gets projections from the mitral cells. This is, interestingly, a trigger zone for some people with epileptic seizures. So some people who have epileptic seizures have what's called an olfactory aura before the seizure, which means that they smell something that actually doesn't exist. And they smell typically the same thing every time before the seizure starts. So there are examples of people always smelling oranges before they have a seizure, and this is called an aura, olfactory aura. Mitral cells also send axons to the thalamus, which, if you remember, is kind of the switchboard in the brain. Pretty much all of the sensory systems and most of the sensory pathways go through the thalamus before that information is sent to other areas of the brain. So in the case of the olfactory system, information goes from the thalamus to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is responsible for sensory integration, emotion, and reward in decision making. And we're going to talk more about the orbitofrontal cortex a little bit later in this section. Pheromones are biochemicals that are released by animals and act as a signal. So people typically know about pheromones because they are involved in a lot of animal sexual behavior, but pheromones are also involved in bonding between the mother and the child, as well as feeding between the mother and child specifically, so breastfeeding. The mother gives off certain pheromones that allows the baby to smell the mother and locate, and also encourages breastfeeding. There's information in your book about the female menstrual synchrony and how the chemical senses may be involved in this. Be really wary of research on female menstrual synchrony. The existing research is troubled with methodological issues. One, it does happen that women become synchronized, but there isn't strong indication that it's at above chance. So if women are menstruating for 5 days out of the month, there's at least some percentage of chance that those menstrual cycles are going to overlap. So in my opinion, I think female menstrual synchrony sounds like a bit of a myth. And there's indication that it's not caused by pheromones necessarily, but more likely that women living together in the same environments are engaging in a lot of the same environmental habits. So similar sleep cycles, similar eating, and other environmental influences, that if we do perceive, or if menstrual cycles do synchronize, it may be more due to these environmental factors than pheromones. Also interesting in terms of the olfactory system, people can identify their own odor. So if they smell their own odor outside of themselves, they know that that's their own odor, even though most of the time we're not aware of our own odor. They can also identify family members and friends, the odor of family members and friends above chance. Women prefer the scent of genetically different men, which we presume to be adaptive in an evolutionary sense. It's better for people who are genetically different to have offspring together. It kind of increases the immune fitness of their offspring. And finally, just an interesting bit of another interesting study where men smelling women's tears had reduced sexual arousal and reduced testosterone levels, the two of which are correlated, and did not appear to have increased empathy in smelling these tears. So the scent of women's tears actually had an effect on men, and I don't know about the effect of men's tears on women, but kind of speaks to the power of the olfactory system. Moving on to gustation. Different species have different taste preferences, typically based on what types of foods they need for survival. Humans prefer sweetness. This may be because we were hunter-gatherers previously and ate a lot of fruit. Within humans, or among humans, there's a lot of variation in taste, so different people prefer different tastes and also are better at discerning different tastes. So some people, sweet tastes a lot sweeter, for example, to some people compared to others. There are 5 basic tastes: bitterness, sweet, salty, sour, and umami, which is like MSG. Other features that the tongue can sense that are not typically considered taste are spiciness, which is actually a form of pain, temperature, mouthfeel or fattiness, and metallicness. These are not detected by taste buds, but they're detected by other sensory receptors in the mouth and on the tongue. So taste receptors are located on taste buds, and they're on the tongue, under the tongue, on the soft palate or the roof of the mouth, the back of the mouth, and then even in the nasal cavity located above the mouth. Taste buds themselves are located on these little bumps called papillae. They last for an average of 10 days. Each taste bud lasts for an average of 10 days, so a really high turnover rate for sensory receptors. There are individual receptors for each of the 5 tastes. The tongue taste map is a myth. It's not true. So there's this myth that I think is pretty pervasive that, for example, sweetness is tasted on the tip of the tongue, where bitterness is tasted exclusively in the back of the tongue. Sour and salt are on the sides. It is true that there are certain parts of the tongue that are slightly more sensitive to certain tastes, but taste can be detected, all the tastes can be detected on all parts of the tongue. Chemicals from food dissolve in saliva and interact with microvilli, which opens up ion channels, and this is how taste is transferred into neural signals. There are 2 different gustatory pathways in the brain. So both of them start with the taste bud, which synapses with afferent cranial nerves, 7, 9, and 10, and this forms the main gustatory tract into the brain. It's an afferent tract. If you remember that sensory information is afferent, meaning it's heading toward the brain. When it enters the brainstem and then it splits, one tract goes through the thalamus, this switchboard for sensory information, and then that splits and goes to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then the insula, which is the primary gustatory cortex. The insula tract then sends projections to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is where the perception of flavor is. Orbitofrontal cortex is part of the prefrontal cortex. Another tract after the brainstem split goes to the amygdala, which is again responsible for valence of emotion, emotional memory, and the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus controls basic feeding, sleep, emotional functions. We'll talk more about the hypothalamus in some sections that are coming up. Taste is highly affected by expectation. So if people expect to taste something, they're more likely to taste it. Wine taste is affected by the price. People think that higher priced wine tastes better, even though in a meta-analysis of blind wine tastings, non-experts, so not sommeliers, but just kind of lay people, preferred less expensive wine, actually slightly more than the expensive wine. So there's a lot of indication that price differences in wine may not actually reflect people's baseline taste preferences. But a lot of things, other things in wine, like color of wine, makes us more likely to taste one way or the other. They've done studies where they have wines that are like a red wine and tell people it's white, but don't show them the color, and people are more likely to believe that it's white wine. The ambiance of the room, the descriptions. So if you've done a wine tasting, they might say you'll find, nutty notes or hints of lemon or something like that. And you're more likely to taste these if somebody tells you that that's what you're looking for. There are people called super tasters, and these are people who have a higher perception of taste than others. Very, very good sense of taste. It's relatively common, actually. It may be one reason that some people are picky eaters. It's slightly more likely in women, also slightly more likely in people from Asia, South America, and Africa. Super tasters actually have more taste buds, so they actually have more sensory receptors. There are also people called non-tasters who have fewer taste buds and do not have a very good sense of taste at all. Bitterness, it specifically has very strong genetic influences. An aversion to bitterness may be adaptive, actually. There are many toxic substances that are bitter. For example, young leaves are less bitter than old leaves, and old leaves contain more toxic substances. For one example of this, little kids tend not to like bitter foods as much, and little kids are also more susceptible to toxic substances. Other genetic influences on taste include coriander, or cilantro. Cilantro and coriander are the same plant. Some people really, really hate coriander and cilantro, and believe that it smells and tastes like soap. And there's actually a genetic variant that is linked to this perception. Some people feel really, really strongly about their hatred of cilantro. Apparently there's this website where people write haikus to share with other members of this cilantro-hating club. Okay, so moving on to section 3, evolution, environment, and behavior. Evolutionary psychology is a branch of psychology that applies principles of natural selection to human behavior. So we've kind of done a lot of that throughout this course, trying to look back and see why the brain might have evolved the way it did, why behavior might have evolved the way it did in humans. The caveat to evolutionary psychology is that it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to test the hypotheses of evolutionary psychology experimentally. We can never really know why we evolved the way we did. We can't go back in time and test these things. So we're kind of piecing things together from a lot of clues and making a lot of inferences or best guesses. One aspect of the evolution, or one thing that we think we've been able to discern from evolutionary psychology, is that there is this mechanisms that we call innate releasing mechanisms in the brain, and these exist in the human brain and the animal brain, and they're old mechanisms that are triggered by specific stimuli that trigger more specific responses. They're innate, they're not learned by experience, and they're present at birth. And so these are kind of, you might call them instinctual behaviors. For example, in cats, if they're feeling defensive, if they see maybe a dog, they'll arch their back and bare their teeth in a very predictable way, and even kittens will do this. Innate releasing mechanisms in humans include emotional facial expressions. So across all different cultures and all different types of people, the facial expressions for a lot of the basic emotions, so happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, are all the same. And we see them in babies who haven't had time to really learn imitation yet, who are not at the level of imitating yet. Congenitally blind babies also show the same expressions, which I think is very convincing. So babies who have never seen facial expressions before still show this facial expression of surprise when they're surprised by something, happiness, etc. An example of this is babies trying lemons. This is actually just really cute. So babies who try lemons all seem to make the same face in response to very sour things. So you can follow that YouTube link for a compilation of different babies showing a similar reaction to lemons. Mate preferences also appear to be evolutionarily guided. Women tend to prefer earning potential power and education more than men prefer that, which people have suggested may be due to gender roles that existed kind of throughout the evolution of humans, where women wanted a man who is likely to be able to support offspring. They also tend to prefer higher waist to chest ratios, which is also associated with testosterone and possibly higher fertility. Men tend to prefer good looks in women, health, and tend to prefer women who desire family. They also tend to physically prefer a higher waist to hip ratio in women, which is also an indication of a biological indication of fertility. So there tend to be characteristics of mates that males and females prefer that may be based on evolutionary advantages in relative mates, in relative sexes.